The morning fog hung thick over the countryside estate as Margaret Williams stepped out of the black sedan. She wore the crisp uniform of the Royal Guard with pride, her silver badge catching the weak sunlight that struggled through the mist. At 62 years old, she had served the crown for over 4 decades. But today felt different from any mission she had ever undertaken. Margaret's weathered hands gripped the official documents tightly. The papers bore the royal seal and contained orders that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy if word ever got out. She had been personally selected by the new king himself for this delicate task, to retrieve the late Queen's most precious tiara from an unexpected location. The estate before her belonged to Queen Camilla, though few people knew about this private residence tucked away in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire. It was here, according to reliable sources within the palace, that the diamond rose tiara had been secretly moved 3 months after the Queen's funeral. The tiara itself was no ordinary piece of jewelry. Crafted in 1847 for Queen Victoria, it contained 17 of the rarest pink diamonds ever discovered, each stone perfectly cut and positioned to create a crown of roses when worn. The piece had been passed down through generations of queens, always returning to the royal vault after each ceremony. Until now, Margaret remembered the day she first saw the tiara. She was just 23 then, a junior guard assigned to protect the crown jewels during a state banquet. The late queen had worn it that evening, and even in the dim lighting of the ballroom, the pink diamonds seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The queen had caught Margaret staring and had smiled warmly. Later, taking a moment to tell the young guard about the history of each stone, now 39 years later, Margaret stood at the gates of an estate where that same tiara was being kept away from its rightful place in the Tower of London. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had once been enchanted by its beauty in the Queen's presence, would be the one to take it back. The estate's iron gates stood 12 feet high, topped with decorative spears that gleamed despite the overcast sky. A small gatehouse sat to one side, its windows dark. Margaret pressed the brass button on the intercom and waited. The silence stretched on until finally a crackling voice answered. "State your business," came the sharp tone of a woman who clearly wasn't expecting visitors. "Royal Guard Margaret Williams." "Here on official business for His Majesty," Margaret replied, holding her identification up to the small camera mounted above the intercom. There was a long pause. Margaret could almost feel the tension building through the speaker. Finally, the gates began to swing open with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo through the morning. Stillness. Margaret drove through and followed the winding driveway that cut through perfectly manicured gardens. Rosebush lined the path, their blooms now dormant in the autumn chill. The main house appeared gradually through the trees, a Georgian mansion of honey-colored stone with tall windows that reflected the gray sky like watchful eyes. As she parked near the main entrance, Margaret noticed movement in one of the upper windows. A curtain had been pulled aside, and though she couldn't make out the figure clearly, she knew she was being observed. The front door opened before she could even reach for the brass knocker. "You're early," said the woman standing in the doorway. Margaret recognized her immediately as Mrs. Helen Crawford, Queen Camilla's personal secretary and closest confidant. Helen was a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dark blue dress was impeccable, but her eyes held a hardness that Margaret had rarely seen in palace staff. "I prefer punctuality," Margaret replied, stepping into the marble foyer. The house was warm and elegantly decorated, but something felt wrong. The usual bustle of staff was absent, and an uncomfortable quiet hung in the air. Helen led her through a series of corridors, lined with oil paintings and antique furniture. Their footsteps echoed on the polished wooden floors. Margaret noticed that several of the paintings appeared to be royal portraits, pieces that should have been hanging in official residences. Not in a private estate, they arrived at a sitting room decorated in cream and gold. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and the room was lit by several table lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Helen gestured for Margaret to take a seat on a velvet sofa, but Margaret remained standing. "I assume you know why I'm here," Margaret said. Placing the official documents on a coffee table made of dark mahogany, Helen's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about." Margaret studied the woman's face carefully. In her years of service, she had learned to read people, and Helen Crawford was definitely hiding something. The slight twitch in her left eye, the way her hands remained clasped too tightly in front of her, the barely perceptible tension in her shoulders, all signs that she was prepared for this confrontation. "The diamond rose tiara," Margaret said slowly, watching for any reaction. "It was removed from the royal vault without proper authorization. Our sources indicate it was brought here." Helen's composure finally cracked, just for a moment. Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly regained control. "That's quite an accusation, Guard Williams. I hope you have proof to support such claims." Margaret reached into her jacket and withdrew a second set of documents. "Security footage from the vault shows the tiara being removed on September 15th at 11:47 p.m. The person who took it had access. Codes that belonged to Queen Camilla's household." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen walked to the window and stared out at the gardens, her back rigid. When she finally turned around, her face had changed completely. The polite mask was gone, replaced by something much more calculating. "Even if what you're suggesting were true," Helen said carefully, "what makes you think it would simply be handed over? Some things are more complicated than royal orders and official documents." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't going to be the straightforward retrieval mission she had hoped for. There were deeper currents at play here, secrets that went beyond a missing piece of jewelry. She thought about the late Queen's kind smile all those years ago and strengthened her resolve. "Then perhaps we should discuss exactly how complicated things have become," Margaret replied, settling into the velvet sofa and preparing for what would clearly be a long and difficult conversation. Helen Crawford moved to a cabinet near the fireplace and poured herself a glass of brandy with hands that trembled slightly. She didn't offer one to Margaret, who remained seated on the velvet sofa, her eyes never leaving the older woman's face. The afternoon light filtering through the heavy curtains had grown dimmer, casting long shadows across the elegant sitting room. "You want to know about complications, Guard Williams?" Helen said, taking a sip of brandy before settling into the chair across from Margaret. "Let me tell you about the real story behind that tiara." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her instincts telling her that whatever Helen was about to reveal would change everything she thought she knew about this mission. Helen stared into her glass for a moment before beginning. "The late Queen came to visit here 3 weeks before she died. It wasn't an official visit, no security detail, no press, no record in any royal diary. She came alone, driving herself in a simple car, wearing a headscarf and sunglasses like any ordinary woman. The image of the Queen driving herself anywhere seemed almost impossible to Margaret. In all her years of service, she had never known the monarch to travel without proper security protocols. She was different that day," Helen continued, her voice growing softer. "Tired, yes, but more than that. She seemed She asked to speak with Queen Camilla privately, and they spent over 3 hours locked in the library upstairs." Helen paused to take another sip of brandy, and Margaret noticed the woman's hands had stopped shaking. Whatever burden she had been carrying, sharing it seemed to be providing some relief. When they finally came out, both women had been crying. "I had never seen the late Queen cry, not once in all the years I had known her. But her eyes were red, and she kept dabbing them with a handkerchief." Margaret felt her chest tighten. The Queen she had served and admired had always seemed unshakable, a pillar of strength and dignity. The idea of her in distress was deeply unsettling. "What did they discuss?" Margaret asked quietly. Helen set down her glass and looked directly at Margaret for the first time since beginning her story. "Family secrets, Guard Williams. The kind that could destroy the monarchy if they ever came to light." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Margaret felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step into territory that was far beyond her pay grade or preparation. "The late Queen had discovered something," Helen continued. "Documents hidden away for decades, letters that should have been destroyed long ago. Evidence of decisions made by previous monarchs that were questionable." Helen stood and walked to a bookshelf. running her finger along the spines of several leather-bound volumes. She was terrified that these secrets would surface after her death, during the transition of power. She knew there were people who would use such information to damage the crown, possibly forever. Margaret's mind was racing. What does this have to do with the tiara? Helen turned back to face her, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Real, genuine fear in the older woman's eyes. The tiara isn't just jewelry, Guard Williams. Those 17 pink diamonds aren't simply precious stones. Each one was carefully selected and placed to hide something much more valuable. Helen paused, seeming to gather her courage. Hidden beneath each diamond is a microfilm containing photocopies of the most dangerous royal documents ever created. Margaret felt the room spin slightly around her. She gripped the arms of the sofa to steady herself. That's impossible. The tiara has been examined countless times by jewelers and security experts. Has it? Helen asked, raising an eyebrow. When was the last time anyone actually took apart the diamond rose tiara? When was the last time those diamonds were removed from their settings? Margaret tried to remember, but realized she couldn't think of a single instance. The tiara was treated as a sacred object, never to be altered or dismantled, only cleaned and polished on the surface. The late Queen's great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was more clever than anyone ever imagined, Helen continued. She created the perfect hiding place for the monarchy's darkest secrets in plain sight, worn on the heads of queens, displayed at state functions, photographed by thousands of people who never suspected what they were really looking at. Helen returned to her chair and leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Those documents contain evidence of bribes paid to foreign governments, secret agreements that violated international law, and personal letters between monarchs that reveal corruption going back over a century. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Everything she had dedicated her life to protecting suddenly seemed built on a foundation of lies and deception. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Helen's expression softened slightly. "Because the late Queen trusted Queen Camilla with the truth, and Queen Camilla trusts you to handle it properly." "Handle it how?" "The late Queen's final wish was that those documents be destroyed," Helen said, her voice firm with conviction. She spent her last weeks figuring out how to eliminate the evidence without damaging the tiara itself. Queen Camilla promised to carry out those wishes. Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the gardens looked peaceful and normal, a stark contrast to the storm of revelations churning in her mind. "So Queen Camilla took the tiara to remove the microfilms?" "She intended to," Helen replied. "But she discovered something the late Queen didn't know. Removing those diamonds would require completely dismantling the tiara's structure. The craftsmanship is so intricate that taking it apart would likely destroy the piece forever." Margaret turned back to face Helen. "So the documents are still there?" Helen nodded gravely. "Every last one of them. Queen Camilla has been agonizing over what to do. Destroy the tiara and fulfill the late Queen's wishes, or preserve a priceless piece of royal history and risk those secrets eventually being discovered." The weight of the situation was crushing. Margaret understood now why she had been chosen for this mission. It wasn't about retrieving stolen property, it was about deciding the fate of the monarchy itself. "There's something else," Helen added, her voice barely audible. "We're not the only ones who know about this. Someone has been asking questions, making inquiries about the tiara's history. Professional inquiries." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of professional inquiries?" "The kind made by investigative journalists and historical researchers," Helen replied. "The kind of people who specialize in uncovering royal scandals." Margaret sank back down onto the sofa, her mind reeling. The mission she thought would be a simple retrieval had become something far more complex and dangerous. The fate of the crown itself seemed to hang in the balance. "What does Queen Camilla want me to do?" she asked finally. Helen stood and walked to a tall window overlooking the gardens. "She wants to meet with you personally, tonight. There are decisions to be made, and she believes you're the only person who can help her make them." As the shadows lengthened across the sitting room, Margaret realized that her quiet life of faithful service was about to change forever. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times as Margaret followed Helen through the dimly lit corridors of the estate. The house felt different at night, shadows seemed deeper, and every creak of the old wooden floors echoed, like whispers carrying secrets through the darkness. Helen carried a single candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with portraits of long-dead aristocrats. Margaret had been given a guest room earlier and had spent the evening trying to process everything she had learned. Sleep had been impossible. Her mind kept returning to the image of 17 pink diamonds, hiding microfilms that could destroy the monarchy. They stopped at a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor. Helen knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, clearly a prearranged signal. The door opened immediately, revealing Queen Camilla herself. Margaret had seen the Queen many times during official functions, but never like this. Gone were the formal gowns and ceremonial jewels. Instead, Queen Camilla wore a simple navy blue dress and a cream-colored cardigan. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore no makeup. She looked tired, older than her years, and deeply troubled. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, bowing her head respectfully. "Please, none of that tonight," Queen Camilla replied quietly. "Come in, both of you. We have much to discuss." The room appeared to be a private study. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a fire crackled warmly in the stone fireplace. 2 comfortable chairs were positioned near the hearth, with a small table between them holding a tea service. Queen Camilla gestured for Margaret to sit while Helen quietly excused herself, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The Queen poured 2 cups of tea, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the obvious stress she was carrying. "Helen tells me she's explained the situation to you," Queen Camilla said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "I hope you understand why secrecy was necessary." Margaret accepted the cup of tea, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I'm beginning to understand, Your Majesty, though I confess it's more complicated than anything I've encountered in my years of service." Queen Camilla smiled sadly. The late Queen often said that the crown's greatest burden isn't its weight, but the secrets it carries. She paused to sip her tea. She was right about that. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. Margaret watched Queen Camilla's face in the firelight and saw a woman wrestling with an impossible decision. "She came to me 3 weeks before she died," Queen Camilla continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned about the documents hidden in the tiara completely by accident. Her personal jeweler had noticed a tiny crack in one of the diamond settings and suggested repairs. When they examined it more closely, they discovered the microfilm. Margaret leaned forward slightly. How did Queen Victoria manage to hide them so effectively? "She was brilliant, really," Queen Camilla replied, a note of admiration in her voice. The technology existed in the 1840s to create microfilm, though it was rare and expensive. Victoria had the diamonds specially cut with tiny hollow spaces underneath, invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The microfilms are sealed inside glass bubbles no bigger than pinheads. The ingenuity was impressive, but Margaret couldn't shake her unease about what those documents might contain. "The late Queen never told you what was in them?" Queen Camilla set down her teacup and stared into the fire. She read some of them, enough to know they could cause irreparable damage to the monarchy. Letters between her ancestors and foreign leaders discussing bribes, secret military agreements that violated treaties, evidence of the crown interfering in elections in Commonwealth countries. Margaret felt her stomach clench. These weren't just embarrassing family secrets. They were documents that could spark international incidents and potentially destroy relationships between Britain and its allies. "There's more," Queen Camilla continued. "Documents about wealth hidden in foreign accounts. Evidence of the crown profiting from activities that would be considered war crimes by today's standards. Things that happened over a century ago, but would be devastating if revealed now." The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Margaret understood why the late Queen had wanted the documents destroyed, but she also realized what that would mean for the tiara itself. You've consulted with experts about removing the diamonds? Margaret asked. Queen Camilla nodded. 3 different specialists, all sworn to secrecy. The unanimous opinion is that the tiara would be destroyed in the process. The settings are so intricate and delicate that removing the diamonds would cause the entire piece to fall apart. Margaret stood and walked to one of the tall windows. Outside, security lights illuminated parts of the garden, but most of the estate lay in darkness. What about creating a replica? The public would never know the difference. We considered that, Queen Camilla replied. But the craftsmanship required would take years, and we'd need to involve dozens of specialists. The more people who know the secret, the greater the risk of exposure. Margaret turned back to face the Queen. Helen mentioned that someone has been asking questions about the tiara. Queen Camilla's expression darkened. Dr. James Morrison, a historian specializing in Victorian-era jewelry. He's been researching the provenance of several royal pieces for a book he's writing. His inquiries about the diamond rose tiara have been very specific, too specific to be casual academic interest. What kind of questions? About modifications made to the piece over the years, about any times it might have been dismantled for cleaning or repair. He's also been asking about Queen Victoria's personal correspondence regarding the tiara's creation. Queen Camilla paused. Most concerning is that he's requested access to examine the tiara directly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. And his request? Has been denied, of course. But denial only makes him more suspicious. He's now claiming that his research suggests the tiara may contain historically significant hidden elements. The irony was, bitter, a historian was close to discovering the truth through legitimate research, while they sat here debating whether to destroy evidence of royal wrongdoing. Your Majesty, Margaret said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to do? Queen Camilla stood and joined Margaret at the window. Together they looked out at the darkened estate. The late Queen's dying wish was that those documents be destroyed. She believed it was the only way to protect the monarchy for future generations. But I've discovered something she didn't know. Margaret waited for the Queen to continue, sensing that another revelation was coming. The documents aren't just evidence of past wrongdoing, Queen Camilla said quietly. Some of them contain information that could prevent future tragedies. Treaties that are still in effect, secret agreements that could be vital to national security if properly understood. Destroying them might do more harm than good. Margaret realized she was being asked to help make a decision that was far beyond her authority or expertise. The choice between protecting royal reputation and preserving historically significant documents was one that should be made by historians. Legal experts and government officials, not a royal guard. What does the king say? She asked. Queen Camilla was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she had heard the question. Finally she spoke. The king doesn't know. The late Queen made me promise not to tell him unless absolutely necessary. She felt the burden of this knowledge had already consumed too much of her final weeks. She didn't want it to poison his reign from the very beginning. Margaret understood the impossible position Queen Camilla was in. She was carrying a secret that could destroy the monarchy, but also holding information that might be crucial to preserve. The weight of that responsibility would be crushing for anyone. There's something else, Queen Camilla added, turning to face Margaret directly. I need someone I can trust completely, someone whose loyalty to the crown is absolute. The late Queen spoke of you often, Margaret. She said you were the most honorable person she knew. Margaret felt tears threatening to form in her eyes. The idea that the late Queen had spoken of her personally was both deeply moving and terrifying, given the circumstances. What do you need from me? Margaret asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Queen Camilla was about to respond when the sound of car tires crunching on gravel interrupted the quiet of the evening. Both women froze, listening as a vehicle approached the main entrance. Margaret immediately moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Expecting someone? Margaret asked, her training automatically switching her into protective mode. Queen Camilla shook her head, her face pale in the firelight. No one knows I'm here tonight. This was supposed to be completely private. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the night, followed by footsteps on the stone pathway leading to the front entrance. Margaret could make out the silhouette of a tall man in a long coat, but the security lighting made it impossible to identify him clearly. "Stay here," Margaret said firmly, moving toward the door of the study. "I'll handle this." But before she could leave the room, they heard Helen's voice in the corridor outside, speaking in hushed, urgent tones with someone whose voice Margaret didn't recognize. The conversation was brief, and then came the sound of footsteps approaching the study. Helen knocked on the door using the same signal from earlier. But when Queen Camilla called for her to enter, Helen's face was tense with worry. "Your Majesty." "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have an unexpected visitor," Helen said, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Dr. James Morrison is here. He says he has urgent information about the tiara that can't wait until morning." Margaret felt her blood run cold. The historian who had been investigating the tiara had somehow tracked them to this private estate. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Queen Camilla stood silent for a moment, then straightened her shoulders in a gesture Margaret recognized as the Queen preparing to face a crisis. "Show him in, Helen, but stay close." Margaret positioned herself near the fireplace where she could observe Dr. Morrison while remaining partially in shadow. When Helen returned with their unexpected visitor, Margaret was surprised by what she saw. Dr. Morrison was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with sandy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a well-tailored but rumpled suit that suggested he had traveled some distance quickly. Most surprising of all, he looked genuinely frightened. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly but keeping his eyes fixed on Queen Camilla's face. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have information that couldn't wait." "Dr. Morrison," Queen Camilla replied coolly. "I'm curious how you knew to find me here." The historian shifted nervously, glancing briefly at Margaret before returning his attention to the Queen. "I've been following certain patterns of movement related to royal artifacts. When the Diamond Rose Tiara was moved from the Tower of London, I was able to track its general direction through unofficial channels." Margaret's suspicion deepened. Tracking royal movements required either high-level security clearance or connection to people who had such access. This man was more than just an academic researcher. "What information do you claim to have?" Queen Camilla asked, gesturing for Dr. Morrison to sit in the chair Margaret had vacated instead of sitting. Dr. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila folder. Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward the service weapon concealed beneath her jacket. But the historian only pulled out several photocopied documents. "These are copies of letters I found in the private papers of a deceased jeweler who worked for the royal family in the 1960s, he said, holding out the papers. "Letters from Queen Victoria's personal diary, describing the true purpose of the Diamond Rose Tiara." Queen Camilla took the documents but didn't look at them immediately. "And what purpose would that be?" Dr. Morrison glanced around the room nervously. "Your Majesty, Queen Victoria created the tiara as a repository for information that could protect the monarchy from future threats, but also information that could destroy it if misused." Margaret exchanged a look with Queen Camilla. This man knew far more than they had realized. "The jeweler's papers include detailed drawings of the tiara's construction," Dr. Morrison continued, his voice gaining confidence. "The hollow spaces beneath the diamonds, the microfilm storage system, even the special sealing techniques used to hide the documents." Queen Camilla finally looked down at the photocopied letters, scanning them quickly. Margaret could see her expression changing as she read. "Dr. Morrison," the Queen said carefully, "what exactly do you want?" The historian took a deep breath before answering. "Your Majesty, I'm not just a researcher. I work for a government security agency that monitors threats to national stability. We've been aware of the tiara's true nature for several years, but we've never attempted to access the hidden documents out of respect for royal privacy." Margaret felt the situation becoming more dangerous by the moment. If government agencies were involved, this was no longer a private royal matter. "That changed last week," Dr. Morrison continued. We intercepted communications suggesting that foreign agents are planning to steal the Tiara, specifically to access those documents. They know what's hidden inside. Queen Camilla sat down heavily in her chair, the weight of this new revelation clearly overwhelming her. Foreign agents? We believe they represent interests that would benefit from destabilizing the British government, Dr. Morrison said. The documents in that tiara could provide ammunition for international enemies who want to damage Britain's relationships with its allies. Margaret stepped forward from the shadows. How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know you're not one of those foreign agents yourself? Dr. Morrison reached slowly into his jacket again and produced an identification card. Margaret examined it carefully. It appeared genuine, identifying him as an operative with MI5. The security services have been watching this situation develop for months, he said. We know about the late Queen's wishes to destroy the documents. We also know that Queen Camilla has been struggling with how to honor those wishes while preserving the tiara. Queen Camilla looked up from the letters she had been reading. These diary entries suggest that Queen Victoria intended the documents to serve as protection, not just hidden history. Dr. Morrison nodded. That's correct. Some of the information hidden in that tiara could be vital to current national security interests, but other parts could indeed cause significant diplomatic damage if released inappropriately. Margaret realized they were facing an even more complex situation than she had imagined. It wasn't just about royal secrets anymore. It was about national security and international relations. What are you proposing? Queen Camilla asked. Dr. Morrison sat down and leaned forward earnestly. We need to extract the documents safely and have security experts examine them. The truly dangerous information can be destroyed or secured, while historically significant materials can be preserved under appropriate classification levels. And the tiara? Our specialists believe they can remove the diamonds and microfilms without destroying the piece. It would require extremely careful work, but it can be done. Queen Camilla was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the options. Margaret could see the exhaustion in her face. The burden of carrying this secret alone had been enormous. There's something else? Dr. Morrison added quietly. The foreign agents planning to steal the tiara. We have reason to believe they've already infiltrated the estate's security system. Helen, who had been standing quietly by the door, suddenly gasped. That's impossible. We have the most advanced security available. Dr. Morrison shook his head grimly. They're not amateurs, and they may be planning to make their move tonight. As if summoned by his words, the lights in the study suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness except for the flickering glow of the dying fire. The darkness was complete except for the red glow of dying embers in the fireplace. Margaret's training kicked in immediately. She grabbed Queen Camilla's arm and guided her toward the far corner of the study, away from the windows. Helen's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Everyone stay calm, Margaret whispered urgently. Dr. Morrison, do you have a weapon? Standard service pistol, came his quiet reply from somewhere near the door. Margaret felt along the wall until she found a heavy oak desk, then positioned Queen Camilla behind it. The Queen remained remarkably composed, though Margaret could feel her trembling slightly. Helen, where is the tiara right now? Margaret asked in the lowest voice possible. Safe room in the basement, Helen whispered back. Access through the kitchen? Outside, they could hear the sound of vehicles approaching, more than one, moving slowly with engines barely audible. These weren't casual intruders. They were professionals who understood stealth. Dr. Morrison had moved to the window and was peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. 3 vehicles, possibly 4 operatives, he reported quietly. They've cut the main power, but backup generators should kick in soon. As if responding to his words, emergency lighting flickered on throughout the house, casting an eerie red glow down the corridors. Margaret could see Dr. Morrison more clearly now. He held his weapon professionally, and his earlier nervousness had been replaced by focused concentration. Margaret, Queen Camilla said softly, there's something I need to tell you. The tiara isn't the only thing in that safe room. Margaret felt her heart sink. What else? Other pieces? jewelry that contains similar hidden documents. Queen Victoria wasn't the only monarch who used this method of preservation. Dr. Morrison spun around from the window, his face grim in the red emergency lighting. How many other pieces? 4 necklaces, 2 bracelets, and a ceremonial sword, Queen Camilla replied, spanning nearly 2 centuries of royal secrets. The sound of breaking glass came from somewhere in the house, a window being forced open. Margaret made a quick decision. Helen, lead us to that safe room now. Dr. Morrison, rear guard. Your Majesty, stay between us. They moved quickly but quietly through the corridors, using the red emergency lighting to navigate. Margaret's senses were hyper-alert. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound might indicate the intruders. Location: the kitchen was a large space with modern appliances and a central island. Helen led them to what appeared to be a pantry door, but when she pressed a hidden switch, it revealed stairs leading down to a reinforced basement. Motion sensors will alert them to our location, Dr. Morrison warned as they descended the stairs. The safe room is shielded, Helen replied. Once we're inside, they won't be able to track us. The basement was more sophisticated than Margaret had expected. The walls were lined with what appeared to be steel, and the safe room door was clearly designed to withstand serious assault. Helen input a complex code and the heavy door swung open. Inside, the room was small but well equipped with communication systems, a small arsenal of weapons and emergency supplies. And there, displayed on velvet-lined shelves, were the most extraordinary pieces of jewelry Margaret had ever seen. The diamond rose tiara sat in the center, its pink diamonds catching the overhead lighting and casting tiny rainbows on the walls. But surrounding it were necklaces, bracelets, and other pieces that clearly held similar secrets. Each item was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but also a repository of potentially explosive information. Dr. Morrison was examining the communication equipment. Phone lines are cut, but we have satellite uplink. I can contact backup. How long until they arrive? Margaret asked. 20 minutes minimum, he replied. Already typing codes into the satellite phone. Queen Camilla had moved to the display shelves and was looking at the jewelry with an expression of profound sadness. Generations of secrets, she murmured. Generations of burdens passed down from one monarch to the next. A loud bang echoed through the house above them. The intruders were no longer trying to be subtle. Margaret checked her weapon and positioned herself near the safe room door. Your Majesty, she said, we need to make a decision now. If these people are willing to break into a royal estate, they won't hesitate to use violence to get what they want. Dr. Morrison looked up from the communication device. Backup is confirmed, but we need to hold our position for 20 minutes. Helen had moved to her cabinet and was pulling out additional weapons. The safe room was better equipped than Margaret had realized. The door will hold against small arms fire, but if they have explosives... Her words were cut off by the sound of footsteps on the kitchen floor above them. The intruders had found the entrance to the basement. Dr. Morrison, Queen Camilla said suddenly, her voice filled with decision. Your specialists who can safely remove the hidden documents. How quickly can they work? With the right equipment, perhaps 12 hours for all pieces, he replied, still monitoring the stairs through a small security camera. Then we remove everything tonight, the Queen declared. Right now. Margaret stared at her in disbelief. Your Majesty, with respect, this isn't the time for jewelry maintenance. Queen Camilla moved to a different cabinet and withdrew what appeared to be a specialized toolkit. Dr. Morrison, Helen told me about the security services capabilities. Do your people have portable equipment for document extraction? Dr. Morrison's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You want to extract the microfilms now, here? I want to end this tonight, Queen Camilla said firmly. If those documents are removed from the jewelry, then these people have no reason to pursue the pieces further. The secret dies with us and the monarchy is protected. The sound of footsteps was getting closer on the stairs. Margaret could hear voices speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, confirming Dr. Morrison's assessment about international agents. I have extraction tools in my car, Dr. Morrison said quickly. Miniaturized equipment designed for field operations. Your car is outside with the intruders, Margaret pointed out. Dr. Morrison smiled grimly. Not that car? I-5 doesn't rely on single backup plans. He moved to what Margaret had assumed was a ventilation grate and pressed a hidden release. The grate swung open to reveal a tunnel entrance. Emergency exit, Helen explained. Leads to a concealed garage about 200 meters from the main house. The voices on the stairs were getting louder and more urgent. The intruders had found the basement entrance. How long to extract the documents from all pieces? Queen Camilla asked. If we work together and focus only on extraction, not preservation of the jewelry itself, maybe 2 hours, Dr. Morrison replied. Margaret realized what Queen Camilla was planning. You want to destroy the evidence while they're trying to break in? I want to complete what my predecessor started, Queen Camilla said, her voice filled with royal authority. The late Queen trusted me to protect the monarchy. That's exactly what I intend to do. The sound of the safe room door being tested echoed through the chamber. Someone was examining the lock mechanism from outside. Dr. Morrison grabbed his equipment bag and headed for the tunnel entrance. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Hold them off until then. As he disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, Margaret heard the distinctive sound of electronic equipment being set up outside the safe room door. The intruders weren't just trying to force their way in, they were preparing to cut through the reinforced barrier. Queen Camilla picked up the diamond rose tiara and looked at it for a long moment. 200 years of secrets, she said softly. Tonight they end. The cutting equipment outside began to operate, sending sparks flying past the small security camera. Margaret estimated they had perhaps 15 minutes before the door would be breached. Everything now depended on Dr. Morrison's return and whether they could destroy 2 centuries of royal secrets before trained international agents could stop them. Dr. Morrison returned through the tunnel in 8 minutes, carrying a compact case filled with specialized equipment that looked like surgical instruments combined with electronic devices. The cutting sounds outside the safe room door had grown more intense, and sparks were now visible through the security camera. We have maybe 7 minutes before they breach, Margaret estimated. Watching the progress of the cutting torch on the reinforced door. Dr. Morrison quickly set up his extraction equipment on a small table. The tools were remarkably sophisticated, tiny diamond-cutting instruments, microscopic cameras, and what appeared to be a miniature vacuum system for removing debris. I'll start with the tiara, he said, already examining the pink diamonds through a high-powered magnifying device. Your Majesty, I need you to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. Some of these pieces may be damaged beyond repair. Queen Camilla looked at the jewelry display one final time, her expression resolute. The crown has survived for 1,000 years because sometimes monarchs must make difficult sacrifices. Begin the extraction. Dr. Morrison's hands moved with surprising speed and precision. Using a device no larger than a pen, he began carefully loosening the first pink diamond from its setting. Margaret watched in fascination as he worked. Each diamond was indeed hollow underneath, sealed with what appeared to be crystal-clear material. Victorian engineering was remarkable, Dr. Morrison murmured as he worked. These seals have held perfectly for over a century. Helen had positioned herself at the security monitor, reporting on the intruder's progress. They're about halfway through the door. The cutting is accelerating. Margaret checked her weapon again and took a defensive position, where she could cover both the main entrance and the tunnel opening. If Dr. Morrison's backup didn't arrive soon, they would be facing professional operatives. In a confined space, the first microfilm emerged from the diamond rose tiara, a tiny cylinder no bigger than a grain of rice. Dr. Morrison immediately placed it in a small device that appeared to scan its contents. This one contains correspondence between Queen Victoria and the German Kaiser, he reported. Discussions about territorial agreements that violated the Congress of Vienna. Queen Camilla nodded. Destroy it. Dr. Morrison placed the microfilm in what appeared to be an acid bath where it dissolved instantly. One down, 16 more in just this piece. The extraction process was methodical but time-consuming. Each diamond had to be carefully removed, the microfilm extracted, its contents briefly verified, and then destroyed. Margaret watched the security monitor with growing anxiety as the cutting torch made steady progress through the reinforced door. Fourth diamond done, Dr. Morrison announced. This one documented secret payments to colonial administrators. Destroyed. Helen, Margaret called quietly. Any other exits from this room? Helen shook her head. The tunnel is our only alternative route. And it leads to the garage where Dr. Morrison's backup equipment is stored. As if summoned by her words, sounds echoed from the tunnel, voices and movement coming from the direction of the hidden garage. Margaret's heart sank as she realized the intruders had discovered the alternate entrance. We have company from both directions, Margaret announced, moving to a position where she could cover both the tunnel and the main entrance. Dr. Morrison's hands never paused in their work. 5 more diamonds extracted. Contents include military intelligence sharing agreements and evidence of British involvement in foreign election manipulation. All destroyed. The cutting torch outside suddenly stopped, and Margaret could hear voices arguing in what sounded like Russian. Through the security camera, she could see figures moving around the partially cut door. They're preparing to breach, Helen warned. Queen Camilla moved to help Dr. Morrison, handing him tools and disposing of extracted microfilms. How many more pieces after the Tiara? 6 major pieces, probably 40 to 50 more microfilm capsules, Dr. Morrison replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the safe room. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel was getting closer. Margaret realized they were about to be caught between 2 groups of determined intruders with only minutes remaining in the extraction process. Dr. Morrison, Margaret said urgently. What's the status on your backup? He paused for just a moment to check a small communication device attached to his equipment case. 2 minutes out. But they don't know about the tunnel entrance. Margaret made a tactical decision. Helen, can you contact them and guide them to the tunnel? Helen nodded and moved to the satellite phone. As she began transmitting coordinates and directions, the lights in the safe room suddenly began flashing. Someone had activated an emergency signal system. That's not our people, Dr. Morrison said grimly. The intruders have found the main electrical panel. The cutting torch resumed outside with increased intensity. Through the security camera, Margaret could see that the attackers had brought additional equipment and were working to complete their breach in minutes rather than hours. Queen Camilla suddenly stopped helping with the extraction and moved to a different cabinet. When she turned around, she was holding what appeared to be a small explosive device. Your Majesty, Margaret said in alarm, what is that? Emergency protocol, Queen Camilla replied calmly. If the safe room is compromised, everything inside can be destroyed instantly. It's designed to protect state secrets. Dr. Morrison looked up from his work, his face pale. That would destroy everything in here, including us. Queen Camilla met his gaze steadily. Sometimes the crown requires the ultimate sacrifice. Margaret felt the weight of the moment. They were facing a situation where the Queen of England was prepared to sacrifice her own life to protect royal secrets. The training and loyalty of a lifetime warred with basic human survival instinct. The sound of gunfire suddenly erupted from the tunnel. Dr. Morrison's backup team had arrived and engaged the intruders approaching from that direction. At the same moment, the cutting torch outside completed its work, and the reinforced door began to swing open. Contact! Margaret shouted, raising her weapon as armed figures in black tactical gear began entering the safe room. Dr. Morrison continued working frantically on the extraction even as gunfire filled the confined space. Margaret returned fire, using the heavy furniture as cover while protecting Queen Camilla's position. Extraction complete on the Tiara. Dr. Morrison announced, moving to the necklaces. One of the intruders shouted something in Russian and pointed directly at the jewelry display. Margaret realized they knew exactly what they were looking for. This was no random theft. Helen had taken cover behind the communication equipment and was relaying tactical information to the backup team in the tunnel. The sound of gunfire from that direction suggested a major firefight was underway. Queen Camilla, still holding the emergency destruction device, looked at Margaret with an expression of profound determination. Margaret, 40 years of faithful service. I'm asking for one final act of loyalty. Margaret understood what the Queen was asking, permission to destroy everything in the room, including themselves, rather than allow the royal secrets to fall into foreign hands. But before Margaret could respond, the gunfire from the tunnel ceased abruptly, and Dr. Morrison's voice cracked over a radio. Safe room, this is British intelligence backup team. Area secured. Stand down. The intruders in the safe room hesitated, looking around in confusion as their support team had apparently been eliminated. Margaret seized the moment of uncertainty. Drop your weapons, she commanded. You're surrounded. The lead intruder said something sharp in Russian, and his team began to comply, placing their weapons on the floor. The mission that had begun with a simple order to retrieve a stolen tiara had ended with an international incident involving foreign agents and state secrets. Dr. Morrison completed the extraction process on the final piece of jewelry as armed British intelligence operatives entered the safe room from both entrances. Queen Camilla set down the emergency destruction device with hands that trembled slightly. The first sign of stress she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. 2 hours later, sitting in the estate's main drawing room while intelligence officers debriefed the participants and processed the captured intruders, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her quiet life of royal service had changed. Queen Camilla sat across from her, looking exhausted but relieved. It's over, the Queen said quietly. 2 centuries of secrets finally put to rest. Dr. Morrison approached them, carrying a small case containing the extracted documents. Your Majesty, the intelligence services will need to examine these, but I can assure you they'll be handled with appropriate discretion. Queen Camilla nodded. And the jewelry? Damaged but repairable. The pieces can be restored to their original appearance, though they'll never again carry hidden secrets. Margaret stood and walked to the window, where dawn was beginning to break over the estate gardens. The diamond rose tiara sat on a nearby table, its pink diamonds still beautiful despite the careful extractions that had removed their hidden contents. The late Queen would be proud, Margaret said, turning back to Queen Camilla. You fulfilled her final wish.